but Dr. Bonanni's still teaching internal medicine in Rochester, New York. And a recent photo of him on the website, the photo on the left his wife gave me. But I think he recognized early that genetic studies or studies of families may provide great knowledge. And in 1965, Dr. Bonanni, as a medical resident, investigated a large family and showed 8 patients in that same family, including the 2 cases that I just mentioned to you. The 2 sisters and the mother and daughter actually happened to be in the same family. And a decade later, Dr. Bonanni and others recognized that, and there were 4 new cases in that family. And this is the pedigree of the family. Dr. Bonanni examined almost everybody on this pedigree, and it shows a few important things. So this is the mother and daughter here, and this is the 2 sisters, and then these are the 4 other cases, another instance of vertical transmission. So he was, I'd say, one of the leaders many years ago in recognizing that studying diseases in families may be very helpful, and he still cared for this gentleman who was concerned about his risk for IPF because his mother, her sister were the twins, and his brother and his son had developed IPF and died from it. So this individual helped us get our study started and to develop the information about this family that is pivotal in helping understand the transmission patterns for IPF. So father to son transmission is highly important because it means a dominant gene and it's not the X or Y chromosome. And then you can see vertical transmission on the left through 4 generations. So Anis Marnia, a medical student in our division, worked with this family and developed this information and reported as an abstract at the ATS, and was really an abstract at Aspen, but it was the initial foray of our group in the early 2000s to study IPF in families. So IPF in families has been reported from all around the world, from Australia. You can see the list on the slide and in your handout. It's an old slide. Actually, there are now more than 600 families in the U.S. In our group. There's certainly many families in Japan. And I think whether it occurs in Africa or other areas of the world is not known. There are no reports that I know of, but absence of information is not evidence of absence of the disease condition. So one of the best reports at that time was from Richard Marshall, and this is not University of Kentucky, this is United Kingdom. So he was in London, and there were 25 families. So this information was collected by sending letters to every pulmonologist in Britain and asking did they have any patients that they knew had IPF in their families. And he got response from all those physicians that there were 25 families that had 67 patients. Again, we talked earlier today about, I'm not sure what's causing the feedback. If I'm doing something, tell me about it. But there were, again, male to female ratio, just like you heard in sporadic patients outside of families. There was a male to female ratio of 1 or 2 to 1. The only difference in families versus outside of families was that the age of diagnosis is younger. It may be 10 or even considerably younger in some of the conditions I'll show you about in a moment, compared to the British thoracic study that was, the mean age was 67. But Dr. Marshall estimated from that experience that the estimate that IPF is familial was 2%, and as I'm going to tell you, that I believe that's a low estimate. But the clinical signs and symptoms and histology were indistinguishable from sporadic. So on the top of the line is Dr. Marshall's experience. There's a report from Finland by Dr. Hodgson a few years after that where he looked and found that almost 4% were familial in Finland, where there's very good genetic information. About that time, I looked back at all the patients who had received lung transplant for IPF at Vanderbilt, and 20% of them I knew had a familial basis that would have been about a 12-year period at that time. There's one abstract from Japan that has a figure that's even twice that, and that's not ever been reported as a manuscript. So I think it's a widely discrepant field. I still strongly believe that it's about 1 in 5 individuals have a genetic basis for IPF, but that figure awaits confirmation, so it's not validated, and so you shouldn't tell anybody else, but I believe it's correct, and someone will eventually validate it when we have the information about incidence in sporadic patients or incidence in families. So of that 20%, only half of it can you get the way Dr. Marshall did by asking individuals. So that's when someone comes to clinic and says, well, my mom had IPF on her death certificate, or my brother had IPF and now I have IPF. So only half of the true incidence can you get on the front end. The other comes from my having been in the same place for 25 years and a cousin coming and saying, my cousin had IPF, you saw him 10 years ago. So the 10% comes when someone else in the family develops IPF, and it helps to have been the same place for a long time, because that's where the other half comes from. So just the synopsis of what I told you already, I believe that IPF in families is more common than the literature suggests. Every time I make this slide, it's outdated, and we now have 266 families that have 2 or more patients, and there's really 600 in the families. In a collaboration, I'll tell you about 600 families in the US that I'll tell you about in a collaboration close to the end. Nearly all of those families have father-to-child transmission, or vertical transmission is going from parent to child, and that is highly indicative of a single dominant gene. So within each family suggests that it is one gene that causes the disease in that family, but it's different genes across different families. We know 4 of those genes, and I'll tell you about those, but that only makes up a small portion of all the families. But the other important thing is there's lots to learn from studying families aside from identifying the genetic basis. And some of that information is from the study reported by Mark Steele with some of our families from the large collaboration. And basically what Mark did was look at the types of idiopathic interstitial pneumonias that happen in each family. And so that was the different types of IIPs that Dr. Johnson showed this morning. There's IPF, NSIP, DIP, COP, AIP, yada, yada, yada. So those different forms are felt pretty much to be different diseases, but if they happen from the same genetic defect in the same family, I think that brings into question, certainly the origin of the disease seems to be the same, whether you get NSIP or CIP. So 31 of the families actually had a variety of those different forms within the same family, and I have a lady who has NSIP and her dad died with UIP, and I think the last time I looked there were 5 individuals in whom a man had IPF and his brother had COP, used to be BOOP. So I think it tells us basic knowledge about those disease processes, and that they may be closer than they're perceived to be clinically by whether they respond to steroids or have more inflammation or less inflammation or more fibrosis or less fibrosis. And that tells us something fundamental about the disease processes.